Hey, Media People podcast listeners, if you enjoy the podcast, then you're going to love our newsletter, appropriately named the Media People Newsletter. Delivered right to your inbox, each edition is a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or go to mediapeople.beehive.com. That's BEEHIIV. Thanks for listening to the Media People podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca or subscribe wherever you get podcasts, including youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. Views expressed by participants are personal. It's episode 100, and we welcome back our episode 9 guest, Interactive Advertising Bureau of Canada President, Sonia Carreno. Sonia was only a handful of months into her presidency when we first chatted back in 2015. 9 years later, Sonia returns to talk about how the IAB Canada has evolved under her leadership, while providing insight into how the organization tackles issues and shapes policy impacting the digital media industry. Before we start, a big thank you to all of our loyal listeners and past guests. We couldn't have hit the 100 episode milestone without your support. Sonia, welcome back. Episode 100. It's been a while. Do you realize it's been 9 years and I would say 91 episodes since we had you on, because you were episode 9 back in August of 2015.
What? That is incredible. And we haven't aged not a bit. So I'm really glad to be here again. It feels like just yesterday.
It does feel like just yesterday. You were in the early stages, let's say less than a year. You had been on the job as IAB president, and you're coming up to what, your 9th, 10th year?
Yeah, this will be my 10th year.
Are you the longest tenured IAB Canada president?
You know, I was thinking about that the other day. I'm not sure, but it's pretty close at this point. Certainly in terms of involvement with the IAB and then becoming president of the IAB, I think that I've got some tenure. But I'm not sure. I think Paula may have been 10 years as well.
How much has the IAB Canada changed from, say, your first year as president to what it looks like now?
It's a great question. And I think that, we don't often get a chance to step back and have a look at, your tenure in retrospect. So from time to time, I do really reflect on this. And when I started in 2015, we were coming off the tail end of being an association that was still very heavily in the gear of promoting the digital media channel. For a few years a few years before I joined, programmatic had really caught its stride. And things were getting automated, but all the problems that come along with automation started to come to light. And so I felt in 2015 that there needed to be a shift between being sort of the industry cheerleader and moving more towards an advocate. And also eventually, I think, to answer your question in terms of, what it is today, it's really become not only an advocate, but also a technical problem solver. So, with all the storylines, if you remember, and you were there, right? Everything from viewability to fraud, brand safety, all of the things that we were really trying to solve for over the past few years. We've done a terrific job, I think, collaborating with other industry associations, and then also working with our partners globally to come up with solutions to help solve for some of those big problems. And then, to elaborate on the advocacy front, a big part of what we do today is to work on policy files and privacy. Again, back in 2015, things were also, privacy has always been an important file for us, but it's just exploded. And in 2018, when the GDPR came to fore in Europe, we knew that whatever was being built out in Europe we needed to prepare ourselves and prepare the Canadian market for here in Canada. So, so I think that we've become a lot, we've grown up a lot since 2015.
So is it safe to say that privacy is probably the biggest issue that the IAB Canada is tackling at the moment?
I think so. If I look back at the things that we've accomplished in these 10 years, I think that policy has really been, the biggest drive. And that started in 2016 or 2015, pretty short, shortly after I started. We wanted to start looking at, it wasn't just privacy, it was all of the things that were going to start affecting our industry. And so, when you think about the greatest hits of policy and over-regulation, the mind goes to things like elections law, marketing food and beverage to kids, regulated categories like gaming and cannabis legalization. All of these things happened on the clock, and privacy just happens to be the one that requires the most global reworking and reimagination of the infrastructure. So I think it's taken a lot of the attention, and it's sort of become sort of the darling file of policy. But that's not to say that the other policy files haven't been a major push for us, whether it's lobbying and participating in submissions with government, or just simply keeping our members up to date and making sure that they're ready for compliance requirements.
How do you know when an issue is finally put to bed? Because there's kind of like two ways of looking at it. One is that, okay, we're settled on this as an industry, let's move on. Or sometimes something bigger comes about and it's like, okay, what was on the front burner has to go backwards, and now we've got to focus on this a little bit more. Like, do issues that you guys work on truly get put to bed and just settled by the industry? Or is there always something lingering in the background that needs to possibly be addressed or that could manifest later on?
Another great question. So I think that, when you look at the type of work that we do, if we are just starting to focus on things like privacy, like the mainstream issues, while they're, 5 minutes before we have to come into compliance, then we're doing our jobs wrong. And so it's always been a balancing act, certainly at the IAB, because we are in some cases years ahead of the final, I guess, passing of a bill, as an example, right? So let's look at a legal issue as one of the acid tests to answer your question, right? So in 2017, we started working on TCF Canada because of what was happening in Europe. But at the time, our members really weren't concerned with it, right? Because it wasn't on the radar. It wasn't something that they immediately needed to, to crack or to understand or to talk to their legal counsel about. Many of our members weren't actually interested in policy at all because it hadn't yet affected them in any sort of concrete way. And so you can imagine how, it's challenging when you're working on something that isn't really interesting at the moment to the majority of your members. And so part of the job is to, make sure that by the time it hits the radar, you've already got a solution for it, or you've put it to bed in the kind of way that allows people to either be extremely informed in a short period of time, right? So, I mean, things like we've been following the C18, the News Canada, the Canada News Act for years before it came to pass. So we started to really formulate a lot of, positioning and thinking around it, and had discussions with our members. And then when it comes to pass, then, our job is done well. And we've put things to bed when our members can call us and say, hey, do you have any resources on XYZ? Because we're kind of scrambling now. And then to be able to point to a whole treasure trove of outputs and content and answers, I think that's when it feels like it's all worthwhile and it feels like things have been put to bed. The other thing is when there's outputs that are developed where it's all about adoption, right? So when we've done our part, And we've provided, for elections, we built an AI solution that was ready for the industry to adopt. To put out a release that says, here you go, it's now available and you can get it here. That's kind of the point at which you kind of, as an association, feel like, okay, it's put to bed. I mean, we have a solution. It's out there. Now it's on our members or on the industry writ large to actually adopt the stuff that we put out.
You mentioned that you do a lot more lobbying, and I believe that means speaking at parliamentary committee meetings. Like, they'll invite you guys in and you get to speak about certain bills that might be in the drafting stage. Take me through what that's like, because you come in as the experts on the subject matter, and you don't get to pick the politicians that you're working with who are working on the bills across the table. And I mean this sincerely to our elected officials and our bureaucrats, but sometimes they do not get online advertising. Do you find that you have to approach that with a bit more preparation, a bit more diplomacy? Like how do you tackle that? Because sometimes you're teaching them about the industry while you're in that meeting that's going to have about a policy that's going to have a big impact on the industry as a whole. Kind of like building the plane while you're flying.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. Yeah, I think that it's certainly been a learning journey for us. To firstly understand the level at which you're dealing with, right? So, various government officials and departments will have varying levels of understanding of the online advertising industry. I will say it's getting better. And I think that general knowledge about data and how data moves through the ecosystem, I think has certainly improved since we started. Ideally, we don't want to just focus our efforts on one group of politicians. The name of the game is, raising all boats by talking to as many people as will listen. You don't know what government will look like tomorrow. So it's always important to speak with opposition members as well. And come at whatever the given subject matter is in a tone that is helpful and that really illustrates, I guess, use cases that are that demonstrate our position. And I think that's the biggest part of the problem, right? So you can't just come out red-faced and spewing against a bill without actually having a well thought out, well illustrated, and well articulated argument as to how this will impact the industry. So I think the majority of the time is spent really crafting that message and working out, how can we bring you onto the same page as us to understand what this impact will be. And also, and this is generally the way that we think, or the way that I like to think, is let's not just go and trash the proposal, but let's maybe provide some guidance or some alternative thinking that could help to square what's trying to be accomplished in any given bill. Right. So and also always keep your eye on the prize, which is, what is the purpose of the bill that you're trying to pass? If it's about protecting a human right, or if it's about protecting children and their health, then that's the goal. The ultimate goal will be to communicate something that works both for industry and preserves industry, but also accomplishes what government is setting out to do. So I think, there's a lot of, it's kind of heady, right? So you're kind of batting ideas around, you're talking to members about how they feel about things. There's a lot of mediation that goes on, and there's a lot of analysis, and certainly I like to spend a lot of time with our global network to talk about emerging issues, so that we can also bring that global perspective into the political conversations. So when we talk to ISED, as an example, or the OPC, we come across as being extremely well informed about global policy developments. That is always, a benefit in the conversation, and it helps to steer the conversation in a more globally aware kind of way.
When you talk to your other IAB counterparts throughout the world, Where do they stand versus us? Are they, what's the best way to put it? Are they dealing with the same policy challenges that we are in Canada? Are they going a little bit deeper into things that we haven't touched on yet? Or do they look at us and go, you guys are looking at things that we haven't even considered, that no politician is even talking about?
I mean, yes to everything. Our global network in 2018, I went to our global summit with a presentation that was directed at all of my colleagues, all of the global peers, to say policy is a global issue, right? So what we're dealing with in Canada will, in a few days, be an issue in Brazil, and what's happening in Europe is going to happen in Canada. And so we need to start getting our ducks in a row, because it became evident that the policymakers in Canada, at least, we're definitely having conversations with the global governments. And so, as an example, speaking with Elections Canada, there would be a reference to, oh yeah, we want to do something similar to what's going on in Mexico. So for us to be able to have a communication with IAB Mexico on what's going on with elections and how that's unrolling is extremely valuable and extremely important. But to answer your question in terms of where everybody is and what they're facing, no, they're not all facing the same things. But at the same time, we all understand that at some point we will. And further is that, whatever solutions we come up with in one market to answer a policy challenge must be valid across the world. Right? We can't just have these localized patchwork solutions that almost pretend that the internet is not that the internet has borders. So if we wanted to come up with some sort of a consent mechanism for North America that just simply doesn't play in Europe, well, it doesn't really work. When you think about the way the ecosystem runs. So for us, it's really important that the global IABs, and we do this now on a regular cadence, which is great. The global IABs get together on a regular basis to talk about what is emerging, so that we can crack on these problems together, and then also have solutions in place so that we can just basically adopt them in other regions as they become necessary.
Okay, you bring up a good point about local policy and how the internet is borderless. So how does, I guess, provincial or state level policy then influence national policy, then influence international policy? Because in Canada alone, we've got Quebec Law 25. And by the way, I went to a presentation at a law firm that the IAB Canada was co-hosting last year, and it was fantastic. Really, really showed us what was going on with that law and the number of different directions it could go once litigation starts. I believe Alberta's also got some sort of privacy laws that they're looking at. I don't know if they've implemented them yet or passed them. And then there's California. California is supposed to be, from when I speak to my American peers, the bastion of like internet privacy. And basically in the United States, if you want to be compliant, you look at California law rather than your local state law. So how does that impact everything you do? Because that's another domino.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the biggest dominoes is the bananas, patchwork that is emerging. When you look south of the border in the U.S., yeah, California has a privacy law that is fairly stringent, that has the highest standards, but at the same time, there's a difference between a highest standard and different standards. So that means that, if you want to go vertically deep into privacy protection, that's fine. But because you can build around that. But then there are some laws that have other elements that are not deep but go broad, which means that whatever solution you're using in California may not be enough for Nevada or for any other state. So that means that we're as an industry we're dealing with. And, we've built through the U.S., we've built a solution called the GPP, which is a global privacy platform that allows for any participant in the industry really to pass signals through based on the requirement in any given state or province. So actually, Canada was one of the first, and not the only thing that Canada has come first in terms of policy or in terms of innovation, which I wanted to make sure that your listeners hear. Canada is actually at the forefront of a lot of this stuff, and the example of GPP is where Canada was the first market to actually have the GPP signal carried through. So that if you're in the U.S. and you're starting to build up to 40 different privacy legislations, you can include Canada in those signals and be protected within Canada. And then meanwhile, the tech lab is cracking along with international players to build signals that are in compliance with all of the different state laws. So the patchwork of legislation is insane. In Canada, I would say that it is particularly difficult because the Canadian marketplace is, relatively smaller market when you look at the global stage. And to have 25% of our audiences now under a much more stringent privacy mandate, that really turns off international investors into our market. And so what you get is you have people saying, okay, well, in terms of, buying media in Canada, if it's a bit of a hassle now to have to come into compliance with only Quebec and to make sure that we have that 25% sort of cordoned off and privacy protected, and that we've got a consent management tool in place only for the 25% of a market that is already fairly low on our priority list. So it's really, and these are the kinds of things that we like to bring to government, is that, be careful with the amount of hoops that you're putting in place that deter global investors from coming into the Canadian marketplace, because you may be putting Canada on the chopping block altogether. So, the way that the Canadian market is now being approached is, well, okay, might as well then just treat all of Canada the same way that we treat Quebec. And that lessens the amount of signal that you're going to be able to access in the Canadian marketplace ahead of a federal privacy law that may or may not be as restrictive as what's happening in California or in Quebec. So it's a huge challenge, and it's one that certainly one that keeps us up at night.
And I can concur with what you're saying about Quebec. So when I was at that IAB event about a year ago, there was one company, I'm not going to say who it is, but they actually spoke up and said that they were so concerned about Quebec Law 25 that they were actually suspending advertising in Quebec. I don't think all advertising, but at the very least digital advertising, because they just weren't sure if they were crossing any lines with what they were doing right now. And I've got one client that I'm working with at my current job, and they've even kind of hit pause on Quebec as well too, because they want to see how things are going to fan out. So when you say that it's going to impact investment, because we kind of look at it and go, okay, maybe people won't advertise in Quebec, but you're right. There's that investment trickles down to Quebec publications, and those Quebec publications aren't going to realize the revenue. And God knows that if you're a news organization right now, you're probably already financially hurting quite a bit.
And the problem is that regulators don't often like to build a correlation to their own regulatory activity, right? So if we do a revenue survey that indicates a drop in investment or a drop in revenue in the Quebec market, can we prove that it's because of the legislation? Probably not. But at the same time, we know anecdotally that it's creating a bit of a nightmare. So, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. When you talk to the regulators, you want to make sure that you keep your eye on the prize. Are you protecting Quebec? Okay, fine. Are you protecting the human right? Okay, fine. You can do that, but you need to understand what the repercussions are, and they're going to be economic. And that means jobs. That means that, the GDP gets impacted. That means a whole slew of things that also are, valuable to the Canadian landscape. So, So yeah, there's a lot of complexity, and getting out ahead of a federal legislation is, certainly not recommended. It creates a real problem for business, and just to put a pin on that whole thing, if 98% of Canadian businesses are small to medium sized, how the heck are they supposed to keep up with compliance costs? Right. So publishers are having to shell out into the hundreds of thousands of dollars just to come into compliance with C-27 and with the legislature, with Law 25. And how are the small to medium-sized businesses supposed to defend themselves in the face of rising overregulation?
We're going to take a quick break. Enjoying this episode? Of course you are, or you wouldn't have made it this far. Complement your listening experience by subscribing to the Media People newsletter at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or at mediapeople.beehive.com. It's a mix of original and curated content designed to feed your curiosity while aiding in personal development. On top of more podcasts, we'll connect you with articles, interviews, and industry events. Subscribe at mediapeople.ca/newsletter or mediapeople.beehive.com. Years ago, and I hope I'm remembering the story properly, you were telling us that you were at an event in New York City. You met someone who started Adblock software, and kind of for some reason, the Adblock mafia pops into my head, where he or she requested a meeting with you, and you thought, okay, we're going to have a productive chat about ad blocking. Maybe you'll understand where they're coming from. And you got to tell the story, because I remember how crazy it was. Something like they sat down with you and they were just like, we're going to take over the internet. Your ads aren't going to run anywhere. Like, they were basically, it's like they had an axe to grind with the industry, and they just kind of like singled you out and were just like, you know what? We're going to tell Sonia this, and maybe she'll tell the rest of Canada, and then we'll take over. Like, is that story correct?
So ad blocking, and anybody who knows me knows that I'm like a staunch supporter of the open web, and the fact that it's supported heavily through advertising. I think what you're referring to maybe was that in 2018 there was an attempt for a new browser to emerge, and that browser was basically in the way that business model was formed was that, okay, so here's what's going to happen. If the publishers want to participate, then they need to register with our browser. If they do not participate, then we will just remonetize their content within our browser experience. We'll strip out their ads, and then anyone who is experiencing our browser or who is registered to our browser we're just going to remonetize the content. So that for us, and I remember very distinctly, writing about it or having some sort of a conversation around the fact that it felt a lot like, a predatorial, but also a little bit of extortionist sort of activity. So there was that conversation, and that happened around 2018. That was when the topic was really hot about ad blocking. And then another conversation was on a panel discussion where there was an academic who was talking about the fact that they wanted to they felt that ad blocking was the only protection for consumers, and I, for good or bad, may have referred to ad blocking as a form of a long dotted line, but a form of theft. So
it is.
So yeah. But not everybody would agree with that, because there's you have to actually sit with me for a while to sort of understand that if you're not part of the industry, right? So it's a bit of a sweepy statement if you're a consumer, from the consumer standpoint, or even from an academic standpoint who is more focused on human rights than focused on the economy. From an economist standpoint, absolutely. If you're taking away a publisher's content or their ability to make a livelihood, then it can be considered a form of theft. And one of the biggest topics right now that's emerging out of Europe is this whole idea of pay or consent. And that's the idea of, There's certain data protection authorities, specifically in Norway, are posing the question, if I'm a publisher and I ask you for consent to use your data and you say no, if the only other option is then to pay the publisher, then is that a violation of human right? And should that be allowed? And if it is allowed, then should government have a say in what a reasonable price is for the publisher's content? So, I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because it gets into the whole, it gets into the dirt of the whole thing, which is, overreaching. And also, like, if a publisher wants to charge X amount of dollars, they should be able to do that. And a consumer should be able to, make a decision just like they do with anything else that they purchase on a daily basis. But apparently, when it comes to news and publishing, there seems to be some sort of an exception that's being made where consumers need to be protected, or their feeling is that consumers need to be protected from having to pay too much to access content, which is the whole premise behind advertising, is to give it to them for free. Interesting times.
It is interesting times, and something to layer on top of that as well. I mean, I've been in the business since 2008. And something that I also think is going to impact news quite a bit is just how picky people are getting about where their ads should be placed. Like sometimes seeing the list of topics that they want to stay away from, like no wonder news is hurting so much. On the one hand, there are the various reasons why they're losing out on the internet, because it's not the subscription-based model that they were used to when things were physical media. But at the same time, too, you've got advertisers going, we want to stay away from this topic and that topic and so forth. And it's like, that's going to start to dictate the news. Because one thing that I've always looked at when it comes to news is that the impact, I guess you could sort of say, revenue is going to have on the stories they cover, rather than covering the stories that need coverage. Like sometimes a council meeting might not be the sexiest thing to cover, but you need to keep having those if you're going to be a body of accountability. And that's what the news media should be.
Oh, for sure. And I think that came to light during COVID, right? Where we, if you remember, during COVID, there was a lot of conversation around echo chambers and, people that are, careful what you're funding, because you're investing in the development of certain echo chambers. If you're cutting out news, and putting all your investment towards certain narratives or certain areas of the internet, you could be, creating irreparable damage to the media landscape. So, one of the things that IAB did during that time was we created like a news allow list for Canadian news publishers, because a lot of the mess that was going on was actually coming from south of the border. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that it was like, okay, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater here. If you want to cut out news because you don't want to hear about certain narratives, like what's going on in the South, or south of us, then at a very minimum, let's, create some sort of exception so that you can still support our Canadian publishers that are, that tend to be a little bit less salacious, right? And still, put your logo or put your support behind content that is being consumed, that needs to be consumed by Canadians, right? So that was the whole purpose behind that. I do sympathize with a lot of brands trying to protect themselves, because I do see that the quality of the news content has shifted. Right? For good or bad, news has become almost like, I'm not going to say lifestyle, but, it's the tone in which stories are being packaged. And that's because, welcome to the attention economy. They need to create drama. They need to create polarized content in order to maintain their viewership. So I do sympathize with brands that are trying to navigate that, for sure.
Do you think a lot of that, though, is on the consumer and their limited knowledge of how advertising works? Because when I was in broadcast, it seemed like the consumer understood that if Hyundai or Honda were in a hockey game or in the news, They said, put me in that hockey game or put me in the news. Whereas, let's say, for example, you're a CPG company. Let's say you're PepsiCo. Just going to pick on them, for example, and you want to reach people that are snacking and you start investing in YouTube. You're going after that demographic, 18 to 34, maybe they skew male or anything like that. And if your video, let's say, for example, your pre-roll ad loads in front of an unsavory political character. I'm not going to call it any names because I try not to get political on the podcast, but it's a character that they disagree with or they know the public disagrees with. The general public, and I've had conversations with family members, they will look at that and go, oh, Frito-Lay supports this person, not realizing that it was algorithmic targeting that put the right ad in front of the right person at the right time and completely negating the fact that they are that core consumer for that branded potato chip. I think there needs to be a bit of education there, but I don't think we'll ever get to that level where people fully understand the way ads are transacted. And I think that's another thing too, that's forcing the clients or the brand's hands to come up with these more approved lists that you were talking about of news sites and news topics to lean into.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, increasingly, and, I tend to speak not on behalf of the industry, but on this topic, I've been doing a lot of thinking around it, and again, I sympathize with the brands because they are in a position where they can't put a lasso around their audience or their consumers in a way that neatly fits into this like correct box of morality and ethics. Right? So you can't choose whether one of the consumers of your food item or your CPG, whatever it is going to vote in a certain way, or you can't dictate what's going to be in their heart. You can hope that, because your job is also, and the question also becomes philosophically, what is the job of a brand, right? Is the job of a brand to make political statements or to create a certain type of population? Or is the purpose of the brand to see ROI and year-over-year growth? Right? Like sometimes we start to lose the narrative and lose the plot a little bit. Right. In all of the purpose-driven stuff, like think about all of the hoops that advertisers have had to jump through over the past 5 years or 6 years. It's insane, right? The amounts of boxes they need to tick and the amounts of risk that has increased year over year if they dare to say something like this, or if there's the wrong shade of something, or if they've said, if they've used the wrong image, or they are walking on pins and needles constantly, and it's all because of this feeling of responsibility, or I'm not sure where it came from, but this responsibility to cater politically almost.
Right? I would blame cancel culture. I mean,
yeah,
they get
sure,
the wrong tweet comes up or the wrong TikTok video criticizing their brand. It goes viral. And then all of a sudden there's this feeling internally at the organization that some sort of correction has to be made. Even though, like you said, maybe the company is just in the business of making snack food and that's it.
I agree 100%. And what you're pointing out also is there's a tremendous amount of risk with influencers on that front, maybe. Right. So like if you can't control your box or your creative or your paid advertisement, that's one thing. But if you license an influencer who then in turn, seems to be speaking on your brand's behalf in a negative way or in a way that causes problems for you, I think that's different.
George Clooney was doing this interview on Inside the Actors Studio, and he was asked a question about what the expectation was from his actors. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. And he just distilled it down to just do what you're supposed to do. And he uses this example of, let's say, for example, you've got maybe a 5-second spot in a movie where you're delivering a pizza. Doorbell rings, you say pizza, you hand it to that person. You don't have to go and develop some sort of crazy backstory about, why am I a grown man delivering pizza? Did I fail at something? Do I have a family? Or was I an orphan? And this is the only thing I've been able to do. I flunked out of school, like all sorts of things. And he just kind of said, he goes, don't go down that rabbit hole. If we've hired you just to ring the doorbell and say pizza convincingly, just do it.
100%. Like, oh man, Honestly, like I hope that we see like almost like a renaissance of brands really finding themselves again, because they've just been, they've had to layer on so many social causes and responsibilities over the years that I'm hoping that they find a way back to themselves.
There was one crypto company. I saw the interview with one of the co-founders a couple of weeks ago, and he spoke about how that was a challenging time for them, where there was pressure from inside the company to take certain stances on certain social issues. And it's not like he was against the issues. He's just like, that's just not what we do. And so they kind of came together and said to the company, look, this is what we do. We offer this service to our consumers. We're going to treat our customers as well as we can. But all of these other issues, those are things for you guys to, if you guys want to advocate for them outside of the company, go for it. But that's not what we're going to do. And if anyone has a problem with that, they put all of these packages on the table and basically said, depending on what your tenure looks like, here's the package you qualify for. You've basically got 2 months to take it. I think they lost, I want to say something between 5 to 10% of employees took the packages and left. But he said that it became a lot more efficient, the company. They weren't bogged down by certain issues that were outside of their own purview. And it's not because they didn't care. It's just because they're like, just that's not what we do. You see what I'm saying? It's like you go into something saying we're going to do this very well, and then a lot of other things kind of come into it. Eventually, you just have to push it away and say, no, we're just going to stick to what our core competency is because that's what we're good at. We're not going to be bad at other things.
100%. Like to me, it's much more valuable to, like, let's take DEI for a second.
Mhm.
Like, if you look at it, like, let's spend $150,000 on an ad campaign that shows that we support DEI, right? Or let's change the way that we employ people. Like, to
Yeah.
me, like, the latter wins every single time, right? Do the right thing. Just do the right thing, and then you're going to be okay. You don't have to, like, spend gobs of budget on, on appearing to be a certain way. Just be that way. Do smart things, right? Like Nespresso, I love the fact that they have, like, figured out how to recycle the pods. Awesome. You're doing the right thing. You're not spending $2 million on an ad campaign about the fact that you're going to do the right thing. You're just doing it, right? And I think that there needs to be more of that, more integrity, and more just good actors, as opposed to more people trying to figure out how to make themselves look like they're doing things.
And isn't that the definition of integrity? Doing the right thing when nobody's looking?
Absolutely.
Sonia, this has been a wonderful chat. Are you ready for rapid fire questions?
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Go.
Okay, so I usually ask people the campaign they're most proud of, but I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you, is there a policy or a decision or something that you changed at the IAB Canada that you are most proud of?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. One is the TCF. I'm extremely proud of keeping on top of the TCF against a lot of headwinds. So I think that I'm really proud of that. But in terms of campaigns, we did autocorrect her. And that was a campaign in 2017 that was all about changing the way that we think about vernacular that's used about women in the workplace. And so it was a Chrome extension that we won a Canadian Marketing Award for, and very proud of the work that was done there. And that was done with Renee Rouleau, an ex-colleague of mine at Proximity BBDO. And so, yeah, proud of that. And then historically proud of the We Are Winter campaign that I was the strategy person on at Proximity.
Your favorite movie?
Office Space, or In Bruges, between those two.
Oh, geez, the Colin Farrell film.
Yeah.
That was quite the dark comedy. It was a good one. It was a very dark comedy.
It was good, but Office Space was also good. And all the Pitch Perfects also. I like silly films, but I also like dark.
If Hollywood were to make a movie based on your life story, who would you want to play you?
Mm, I would go Canadian. I would say Rachel McAdams.
So my follow-up, if Hollywood were to make that movie based on your life story, what would you call it?
I would call it The Long Game. I would say I would call it The Long Game, an epic story of tolerance, grace, and karma.
Your favorite book?
Okay, so I read a lot of nonfiction, but if to be more relatable in terms of like fiction, I would say The Leopard.
You can throw nonfiction out there. A lot of people throw nonfiction out in this segment.
No, I think The Leopard is a masterpiece. So it's an Italian masterpiece. Like honestly, it is. If you haven't read it, it is like it's a marvel. It's a piece of art. Thomas de Lampedusa.
Your favorite song?
Oh man, that's also a hard one because I love music so much. And it would change every single time you asked me. So for today, let's say Wish You Were Here, Floyd.
Best advice you have ever received?
Maya Angelou. When people show you who they are, believe them.
My signature closing question: if you weren't in media, what would you be doing and why?
100 different things. I've got two polar interests. One is medicine and one is the arts, and both are pretty strong. So I'm either, spending my time writing and dabbling in mediums like paint, pottery, and that kind of thing, or I'm working on well-being and doing something in the medicinal field around healing, addiction recovery, diet, that sort of stuff.
Sonia, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's been such a lovely conversation.